It's the Let's Talk Polyamory podcast, where we talk about all things consensual non-monogamy, polyamory, swinging, and all things about how you can have a secure and sexy relationship. Now here's your hosts, Tara and André. Hey, André.
Hey, Tara. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good.
Now that we got the microphones sorted out, I got this new microphone, so our sound can be better for season 2, and was having a little bit of trouble with it this morning. So
it's funny. It's like this is our introduction. Always coming in saying, "Wow, it's working." We're so surprised. It's always the shit show. Can we say shit show? It's always new to me, which is amazing because somehow, you've been able to do all of these episodes, and I say you because you are the incredible IT person behind all this. But it seems each time when it gets off the ground, it's like, wow, this machine can actually fly. It seems like it's beyond marvelous. So here we are. After all
here we are. Well, welcome everybody to the Let's Talk Polyamory podcast with Tara and André. So we're continuing with season 2, and we have an exciting season ahead, which will include some special guests. We met some really amazing people when we were at the Taboo show a couple weekends ago, and so we're excited. And we already had some other people planned, so really excited to have some special guests talking about a whole breadth of topics around non-monogamy, relationships, and how you can have them and feel secure, satisfied, and sexy.
Yeah, it's going to be great. We're going to introduce a whole bunch of different people, like you said, and that'll be a lot of fun interviewing them. But as far as introductions go, maybe we should start with our own. I am a sex-positive psychotherapist, and you are?
And I'm Tara Lynn Franco. I'm a relationship and awesomeness coach.
You sure are.
So together, we started an online community called Let's Talk Polyamory back during the pandemic as a way of building community and bringing people together, but also sharing knowledge about how to navigate consensual non-monogamy, which, I mean, there's lots of resources out there, but it's also a lot. And so part of what our goal is to kind of make this simpler for people to access. And now we have the podcast to do that as well. So yeah, and our courses and programs and our individual practices and such. So yeah.
But it's amazing to reflect back on that, how this all really did start in the pandemic as a way simply of wanting to keep in touch with our friends, but then realizing that we were kind of in a way uniquely positioned as awesome relationship coach and sex-positive psychotherapist, that we could not only make a platform to keep in touch with our friends, but we could also make it a vehicle where we could talk about all the things that come across our minds, right? As far as our sexual identity, our sexual expression, how we relate to each other, and not just in non-monogamy, but in all aspects of it. But it could really be a good platform for this kind of dialogue and this exploration. So it's amazing that we should have this privilege to be able to do that.
Yeah. And so we started off just doing trainings in the group, but now that we have the podcast where we're bringing it out into the bigger world. So if you are listening to us, please like and share and follow us so that other people can find this information. One of the things we have done since beginning is because we have a lot of people that are new to navigating non-monogamy, and as I said, it's pretty overwhelming when you first start, we put together a foundational course called our Poly Newbies digital course. And so we offer that. It's a 7-module course. We offer that to our community at a special price. And so I'll make sure we put the link in the show notes on how you can get it. And you have access to it for a whole 6 months. And so you can take your time going through it. You can repeat things and that sort of thing. And we're adding to it as we go. And we've always had some information in there about trust, which is our topic today. But I think we'll add this new training this week's, because this is part 1, and then the following part 2 to that course, along with some work that you can do to work on your trust. So yeah.
It's amazing, right? Because you mentioned that the idea of it, the title to it is sounds like it's an introduction exclusively for newbies perhaps, but it really is, here we are, we've been at it for all these years now, and I still find a lot of things that I thought I knew I didn't know, or things that I thought I knew well, I find out, well, I could improve on that, or I could always be more curious about it. And it's great that it, for me, resists the temptation to think that I am an expert and I know it all. And then what happens with that, unfortunately, is that the curiosity stops, the dialogue stops. Whereas we come to find out, actually, you know what? We can always be learning. We can always use this as a way of improving the quality of our relationships, improving feelings of trust and the bonds of trust.
Yeah, and the other thing to point out as well is, even though it's called poly newbies, you don't necessarily have to be wanting polyamory. You might just be curious about non-monogamy, and there's some ways of figuring out if it's for you. And there's a lot of things that if you've been doing it for a while, things like we talk about relationship reviews, maybe that's something you haven't done, or maybe you've run into some conflict along the way. So those things are covered as well. So check it out. And yeah. But let's get on to today's topic. So about trust. And I mean, I don't know about you, Andre, but I've heard a lot from people recently. I don't know what it is. I think things sometimes come in bundles. Lots of people talking about trust, in particular of losing trust in their relationship. So I have some clients I spoke to myself, as well as people who reached out to book a call. And this is something that they're coming up against.
It's so interesting. I wonder where the majority of those calls come in, on what side of trust. Do they feel as though their trust has been betrayed, or do they acknowledge that they may have had a hand in breaking trust? Because
yeah, I think it's two things, right? I think it's two things. And so today we're doing part one, which is basically the foundational stuff on trust. So what is trust? How people approach trust in relationships, just like you were saying, like that may be the way they approach relationships. They might not start off in a position of trust. So why, you may have trust issues, how to build trust from the start, maintaining trust, and how trust might be broken in relationships. And we'll give some examples specific to non-monogamous relationships. Not that that's the only place where trust gets broken, but there can be some issues that come up that are particular to being non-monogamous. So.
It's interesting that we do look specifically, or will look specifically at how it might be affected in non-monogamous relationships, because some people, I've heard them say on occasion, well, if you're in an open relationship, then there is no question of trust. There is no possibility for cheating or lying. And maybe that's not quite such an accurate statement.
That is correct. You can lose trust. You can cheat. We've talked about this a couple of times, but yeah, it can definitely happen. And so we're going to talk about that. And then in the part two, we're going to talk more about how to rebuild trust when there has been some sort of betrayal or loss of trust. So let's jump in.
Let's do it.
Awesome. So, I mean, it's probably obvious, but we'll say it anyways. The trust is something that's an essential part of every relationship, regardless of whether it's monogamous or non-monogamous. And without trust, it's very difficult to have a healthy, ongoing, and secure relationship. And so we talked a bit about sometimes people have experienced some sort of betrayal in a previous relationship, such as cheating, dishonesty or abuse of some sort, and may develop trust issues that can interfere with future relationships. But also, some people may have trust issues stemming from other areas of their life.
Right. So even if we start with trust, it's something that can be tested over time and can be unfortunately lost or damaged. We can feel kind of unsure about it in certain circumstances. And it's when it is lost, it is much harder to regain. But that's not to say that it is impossible to regain. We can do certain things. And as you say, we'll look more at that in part two of this.
Yeah. So I think trust is super important, especially at the beginning phases if you're opening an existing relationship or exploring polyamory or when experiencing new things. And
so first, maybe we start with defining then for us, what is trust?
Okay, that's a great one. Do you want to jump in?
Well, there's a lot of different definitions, right? But one of the ones that we found that we really like, and it comes from goodtherapy.org, is defining trust as the act of placing confidence in someone or something else. So
Yeah.
we are willing participants in it. We offer this up, right? We are putting our confidence in that person for whatever reason. And whether it be that they're just new to us or that we already know them, we are allowing for some emotional investment in this person or this thing.
Absolutely. And in another article we read in Healthline, it said that trust can mean actually different things to different people in romantic or relationships. And there's a whole list of things, and these things may or may not apply depending on how you do polyamory, open relating, consensual non-monogamy. So here's sort of a list of those things that you might want to have confidence or trust in. And so you feel committed to the relationship and to your partner. Again, that's with an asterisk that not all non-monogamous relationships are committed relationships, but some are.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, right? Not all of them will have the same level of emotional investment in them. So, for example, if we are partnered with somebody, there's going to be a very high level, or usually a very high level of emotional interaction and commitment. Whereas if we are simply having one-offs or swinging, the emotional investment will be much less. Right. So the level of commitment that we feel comfortable with in our relationships and with our partners.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to the second one, which is you feel safe with your partner and possibly other people that, if you're swinging, for example, that you don't know so much, that they'll respect your physical and emotional boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it kind of goes back to the earlier part of this in saying how trust may be different for different people and at different relationship, different circumstances, but having the consideration of the boundaries, these both really come back to the idea that we will be able to communicate what it means for us. What are our boundaries going to be? What are the levels of trust that we're wanting or willing to offer and engage in?
And that another level of that is that when you communicate those things, that your partner will listen to you and, you know, your needs and your feelings around those things. And you don't feel like you need to hide things from your partner. That would be a higher level of trust in your relationship and your partner.
Not having to hide things from them, feeling as though you are able to communicate your needs and feelings, as you say. So this in itself is a very good demonstration of or indicator of trust, right? That familiarness, that level of comfort when we are able to communicate these things. In the absence of that, does that then indicate that maybe our trust is not at the level we're wanting it to be at? So these are good things to keep an eye on, for sure.
And it might not just be trust, it just might be practice as well. Because sometimes when people first approach and get into non-monogamy, especially if you're coming from a position of opening an existing relationship, you know, you're not used to maybe having relationships or feelings for other people. And so it can be hard to communicate or feeling like you can communicate those feelings and not hurt or impact your partner. But it's still, I think, comes back to trust. That's why it's important to start with trust when you open an existing relationship.
But that's an excellent point. It is ideal to start with trust, but perhaps we are coming from a place where there have been incidents where the trust has been broken, and we are not so willing to just give the person carte blanche and say, well, you've never harmed me before, so I'm going to give you 100% of my trust. Maybe we have history behind it that makes it difficult to do that, and we then are informed by that trauma, and we are going to have to find ways to demonstrate that this person or we could be trusted in these things, right? So that level of trust isn't necessarily an automatic thing. We have to also be aware of where we're coming from or our partner's coming from.
And I'm nodding my head. So people who aren't watching the video that's associated can't see me nodding my head. But I'm nodding my head because I have clients that there was a breach of trust, a cheating episode before they became non-monogamous. And then they worked through it and, you know, opened up and were feeling good about things. But that thing does come back sometimes to impact them because maybe it wasn't actually so resolved and it still feels like an issue for them. So that can be part of those things too. So
that's interesting too, right? So if we have had a history with this and now we find somebody that we think we can share it with, we are in a sense allowing ourselves, or they may be allowing themselves a demonstration of vulnerability, and that demonstration, that willingness to share the vulnerability, is in fact one of the components in building trust. We find out that it is survivable, that we can allow ourselves to be vulnerable, or they can be vulnerable in our presence, and together we can create those bonds of security.
Absolutely. And you feel like you can support each other as well. So,
Yeah.
So one of the other things that, trust doesn't mean is it doesn't mean you need to check up on your partner all the time, that you have faith in them and you feel like you can talk to them about any concerns you might have. And so related to that, I think what trust doesn't mean is that they must tell you everything. And people have agreements around what information they will and will not share. And we actually did a podcast in season 1 about don't ask, don't tell, to knowing all the details. And so that's something that you would talk about and negotiate when you first open up an existing relationship, for example, or when you're starting a new relationship with somebody. How much information do you want to share?
So we come to that in mutual agreements where we say, well, this would work for me, this wouldn't work for me. But it is interesting, and I think it's a very good point, that we do talk about what it doesn't mean. The things that might appear as though it's going to create trust for us, but really they don't demonstrate those at all. And sometimes we almost have to make a leap of faith in the other person to trust them, to find out. Not to say that we are blind to it, we don't close our eyes to all these things, but if I'm simply going to check your phone because it's going to make me feel better, well, I'm not really demonstrating any level of trust. And the trust comes on both sides, right? It becomes both the person, what they're doing, and also my ability to allow for and invite this level of trust, as opposed to simply policing everything because I don't trust it. So I'm looking for finding avenues of security in these demonstrations, but it's not always going to be that place. And then also, as we had somebody mentioned to us not long ago, they feel as though they were on board doing everything that was part of their agreements, and yet their partner, who has issues of trust, was still wanting, insisting other demonstrations, other ways of proving that they had not done anything. And that's not really the demonstration of trust that would serve either of them very well, right? So
yeah, so that's, sorry, I interrupted you.
Please.
No, so I was just saying that if you feel like you need to check their social media accounts or access their phone or something like that, then there's definitely some work to do there in terms of building trust, either within yourself, with your partner, or both, sort of thing. And I think the other thing trust doesn't mean, and I think this is important to state, because people do get this messed up with polyamory and open relationships and non-monogamy, is that you can do whatever you want without the consideration of the other. Which is why agreements, considered agreements and consenting to activities is super important when you're in non-monogamous, or actually any relationship.
Yeah, for sure. Any relationship, right? It's not limited to just non-monogamy. This will go into your family relationships, and relationships with your employer or employees, with yourself. I mean, this is far reaching, right? So it's really about the idea of being able to stand within ourselves and be honest. It's all about honesty. It's really about, can we say the things that might be difficult? Can we hear the things that might be difficult? And can we feel as though this is starting to be the base of trust, that we are able to really share this information?
Exactly. So I think that people start from like 3 sort of positions when they're in relationships with someone. So we're like a baseline. So some people start off in a position of trust. So, especially in relationships, they might feel that it's easy to grant trust from the beginning because the stakes are lower and there's much less to lose at the beginning. But it also could relate to the fact that, you just feel more secure in general. And so your attachment can come into play. And we'll talk a bit about that when you don't trust in a moment. So if your experience has been good with family, friends, other relationships, you might start off in a position of trust with most relationships or interactions with people.
So in other words, we have no good reason not to trust this person. And we've not really had horrific experiences of a breach of trust in the past. So there's no good reason to believe that we couldn't trust this person. So we come into it where our emotional level of investment is not so fantastic. It's not overly invested. And we say, well, I have no good reason to not trust this person. And I have the idea that as we get to know each other, the trust will build. We have good reason to believe in that, and we allow for it.
Exactly. And then there might be like a mid-level of trust. And we used to, when we originally did this training back in 2022, we only had the 2, but I actually added this one as this mid-level of trust because I had a conversation with my mom yesterday as I was preparing for this around if she feels that she trusts people naturally. And so her answer was quite interesting to me. So I think she trusts people generally, but she said she can be a bit hesitant if it's someone new. And so to her, she sort of said she would have like a mid-level of trust. And, she said, like I said, it's about, it depends on the person. But she said another interesting thing, which kind of caught me and said that it might depend on what she may have heard about this person or what she may have experienced indirectly herself. Mm-hmm. And so that can actually impact how we trust somebody, depending on who you are.
That's such an interesting part, especially the idea of meeting new people, because being non-monogamous, we are, in a sense, inviting that opportunity to meet these new people, whereas on a very intimate emotional level. Whereas if we are in a close relationship, like a monogamous relationship, we might say already, well, that aspect, the romantic aspect or the intimate emotional aspect is kind of already closed, and we're not allowing ourselves, or we're not investing in these type of expressions. But for us who are non-monogamous, we are very much saying, well, yes, I'm wanting to invite new people in. How can I trust them? And to that point, yes, if it is in some ways a small community, maybe I've heard some stuff about this person already.
Yeah, I mean, my personal feeling on that is like, I want to experience the person for myself. And so I don't necessarily listen to third party, second party information and want to experience. Like I might be maybe a bit more careful, I suppose, but I think that things can sometimes, rumors can sometimes get out of hand. And I prefer to trust my own instincts with people. And I prefer to start in a position of trust.
It is ideal, isn't it? I guess it makes me think also a little bit about how we might at times vet people, right? We might vouch for them. We might say, well, I've known this person and I would welcome them into our community. And then we may have heard some positive things about them, or in the absence of hearing anything, just the fact that they are vetted, we then put it upon them to say, well, you've been vetted. I can appreciate that you are informed on this way, that I can trust you, that there's no good reason to not be. So it is, in a sense, almost trust by extension.
Yeah. A funny story my mom told me, I just want to share this because it made me laugh, is when she first met my dad, she was a little bit hesitant in trusting him because she had heard some things about him. And then I guess, maybe that he was a rascal. I don't really know. Somebody used that term when we met at the Taboo show. Maybe that she said something like that. But what's interesting was the first date, he took her to show her the locks and how they worked. And so she's like, this doesn't sound like what I heard about him. And so that immediately earned her trust again. So that was kind of interesting. So, and also probably taught her a bit of a lesson about trust.
There's so many interesting points to touch on that story. But for me, the one that I really want to talk about is the idea how we can meet somebody anew. So maybe in the past, it might have not gone so well, but are we able to revisit trust? Can it be restored? And that, again, is something that we'll look into in greater depth in part 2 of the series.
Yeah. So then there's a third type of person, which is where you need people to earn our trust. And so you may have trust issues more generally. And you want to make a connection, you want to be in a relationship, but you may come from a place where you've been hurt or trust has been lost in previous relationships. So it's a bit more difficult. And so I think people kind of fall into those 3 sort of categories generally.
The beauty about being in number 3, it doesn't sound like it's a great place to be because you've had some issue of trust already. But the good part about it is that we then are able to utilize that awareness as the base for correcting that and say, well, what happened in the past does not necessarily indicate what's going to happen in the future. I am aware that there have been these transgressions in the past, but I'm not going to automatically assume that everybody's going to be like this. I'm aware of the feelings, I'm aware of my vulnerabilities, but I will go beyond that and try to meet this person at that level, what feels comfortable for me. But I don't close the door on relationships. I don't close the door on people being trustworthy. And I don't just shy away from my own vulnerabilities. I acknowledge it and say, well, I want to connect, and there are good people there.
Absolutely. So if you're wondering if you're someone who has trust issues, here are some signs that you may have trust issues. And it's from an article in Very Well Mind by Kendra Cherry. So one of the signs might be that you're always assuming the worst. So you're coming from a position, future forecasting, that the bad thing is going to happen, and you're just waiting for the next shoe to drop. So that's one of them.
Yeah, and it sounds like a very sticky, uncomfortable place to be, and it is always assuming the worst. But we again may be informed that we do adopt this position as a way of being proactive or preventative, because we are wanting to protect ourselves from being vulnerable. So we will already assume the worst case scenario. Unfortunately, what happens very often is that we will then be the drivers in making sure that it does go south, so that we will not put ourselves in these positions of vulnerability, right? So we've already manifested this and made it come to be as a way of protecting ourselves. So if we find ourselves doing that, it may again be a sign of trust issues. Are we always assuming the worst?
Yeah. So one of the other things is suspiciousness. So if you do have trust issues, you may be suspicious of other people's activities, even if there's little indication that there's need to be suspicious.
Right.
Do you find yourself a suspicious person, André?
I'm sorry, repeat that. Am I the suspicious person?
Do you find yourself suspicious or assuming the worst? I'm just curious. We just covered two of them, but I'm just interested in knowing if you feel that.
That's an excellent question. If I see it personally, no, I'm rather optimistic. I like to think. I like to think that the worst isn't going to happen. I like to think that the best is going to happen. That for the most part, people will be trustworthy, and I have no good reason to believe that they wouldn't be. But I have been hurt in the past, like other people, and there are times maybe when I am feeling less well about myself. If I'm tired, for example, maybe I am then not wanting to be as forthcoming, and I might want to reserve some of that and not make myself so vulnerable. But I don't think it goes to the point of feeling suspicious. But I think it does remind me very much of, I think I kind of alluded to it before, of a couple that we know who recently spoke about that. There's no good reason for this person to have a level of suspicion, and it makes their partner feel as though they're always trying to prove what they've not done, trying to prove the negative. And that's almost impossible to do, but also it really does speak to the first partner, the suspicious partner will say, who is informed by their past trauma and who is now suspicious about all these different scenarios. And they start to look for cause even when there is no cause.
Right. But you may be suspicious with reason, right? If there has already been a betrayal, that could be something that could cause you to be a bit more suspicious or watching for other evidence that might suggest that something is going on. But these things too, like you know, suspiciousness is not always to be ignored. If you are feeling suspicious, maybe it's an indication of something that you need to pay attention to.
That is a great point. So there's actually, it sounds to me, there's 2 points to that, right? One might be the past that is informing us of this, or is this an induction? Am I normally not suspicious, but yet when I'm in this relationship with this person, are there red flags going up? We are informed by our feelings, and they generally don't come from nowhere. They come from somewhere. What is informing me? So is it myself historically, or is it something in this person? Either way, it warrants our curiosity, our investigation into this.
So another sign that you may have trust issues is around like a history of unhealthy relationships. And so if it feels like you're constantly in these situations where you struggle to build healthy, long-lasting relationships, it may be that you're having some trust issues in terms of in those connections. So if you constantly are going through the cycle of that, that could be an indication.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So we look for these patterns, we look for these repetitions. And then again, once we have that awareness, we are able to figure out what is at play and how we have a different outcome.
Mhm. So another sign might be you have difficulty giving forgiveness. And so holding on to things that maybe have hurt you and not letting go of them.
You know, again, to me, this speaks about past traumas and how we're not wanting to simply deny them or turn away from them, because then what's to say that they're not going to happen again? So if we've had a hard time finding it possible to forgive, is it because perhaps we're not seeing enough of the change, or we're not showing any kind of demonstration that things are going to be in any way different? Is it, again, a way of protecting myself from being in that position, being vulnerable? So maybe I don't forgive because I feel as though if I were to simply forgive or forget, it could recur. Really, I think, and we talk again about this later in the second one, what demonstrations of change are we going to make that's going to allow for the ability to forgive?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you may also recognize trust issues in yourself if you find yourself distancing yourself in relationships. And so keeping a distance with people so you don't get too close and you don't allow that vulnerability in, and you sort of keep that distance. So that may indicate a lack of trust or trust issues generally.
It's interesting that you should mention that, because maybe we see that, but I wonder what happens when we come across somebody who might feel distant or hard to get close to. Do we consider where they're coming from, and maybe that is informing them? Maybe that is part of the reason why they are not lending themselves so easily to this type of connection.
Yeah, and if you're partnered with someone like that, then it might be an opportunity. Like, we like to think about opportunities to find ways of bringing them in closer, creating a safe space for them to trust, and demonstrating how you can be trustworthy. But we're gonna go, and that's a little bit later. That's an example. I skipped one, which I think is important, which is self-sabotage.
What do you want to say about that?
With trust issues can self-sabotage. So I'm going to end this relationship now so that I won't be disappointed later. This person's just going to disappoint me, so I'm just going to get it over with and do it now.
So we are preemptive in a way of protecting ourselves from our vulnerabilities, from appearing vulnerable, from being vulnerable.
Yeah. Exactly. And then the last one is focusing on the negative. So people with trust issues tend to focus on, no matter what the situation is, what you expect to go wrong. So you notice other people's flaws, weaknesses, or mistakes rather than focusing on positive qualities. So
it's interesting, because the two, it seems, would probably always be present to some degree in any relationship, in any circumstance. But yes, will we gravitate towards the negative, or will we be able to kind of refocus our attention on the positive? If we focus our attention on the positive, do we feel as though we are then just leaving the back door open and inviting this vulnerability, as opposed to allowing for this and working with the positive to really build that trust, knowing that it is the right way? Again, informed by our feelings, but feeling as though it's okay to focus our attention towards the positive, as opposed to I have to make sure I keep an eye on this fire in the negative.
Exactly. So where do trust issues come from? We alluded to it at the beginning. It could be because of issues in past relationships, betrayals, etc., or it could be early childhood experiences. And you've probably heard this. Psychologist Erik Erikson, that's a hard name.
Is it? They've
wonder why somebody named somebody Erik Erikson. But maybe they were just thought it would be a really cool name, and now they're famous psychologists. Who knows?
But Erik Erikson is one of the people who developed the theory of development that suggests that the earliest years of life are all about learning. And we learn these from people around us. Are they able to be trusted? Do we feel safe in their care? What is the impressions made? Do we feel as though we are able to trust people, or was there some element of mistrust where it did not feel so secure?
Yeah. So that could come from our experiences in childhood, from parental conflicts, for example. So if you witness trust problems within your family, you may fear that the same thing will happen to yourself. And you might bring this into relationships in adulthood. Could have related is attachment styles. We always talk about attachment styles and why it's important to know them. And so you may have had a parent or parents that were unreliable, or you couldn't trust to be there when you needed them. And so this obviously can influence how you might feel in relationships with others, that you cannot trust them to be reliable. You can only trust on yourselves. And so if you do have more insecure attachment, it may impact and provide anxiety in your relationships, and thus some mistrust.
How could it not, right? If we are in these very critical, important base relationships, if they've gone south, then how are we going to come out of it unscathed? Right? But even with secure, good parenting, we might on occasion later on come into some social opportunities, some social constructs where we unfortunately were rejected, or felt as though we had been rejected by our peers during childhood or adolescence. And that can also lead to difficulties later on in trusting people. Right? So we might have had a good base, but then later on had issues where things were not so fantastic, and we did feel as though we were rejected, or there was issue with trust, or that it wasn't lending itself to feel secure in that way. And these repeated rejections can have longer lasting trust issues, making it more difficult to overcome.
Yeah, classically, things that happen in like upper grade school. I know for me, I had some issues with friends that I thought were my friends, and then like totally rejected me, and really made my life difficult in my like grade 8, like, last year of grade school or middle school. I guess it depends on if you did public school or Catholic school, and then carried through into high school. Had a great group of friends, and then again had the same thing happen very near the end, when I was sort of like felt like I was abandoned. I think the thing that worked in my favor was I still had secure attachment in myself, and so I was able to recognize that those things were not about me. But I think if you have that sort of social rejection plus attachment issues, I think it's a deadly combination and can really impact your trust in future relationships.
You're absolutely 100% correct. Yes. But if we don't have either the base or the social network, and these breaches happen, then we might really be adversely affected by it. To that point, I wonder how we are able to, or what we can do to invite greater social accountability. In other words, do we have a network of people that even if one relationship or relationships go south, we still have a voice, somebody where we can feel secure, that we still have other demonstrations of trust? And we are not simply reading this, we are co-authors in this. We develop these networks of trust by being trustworthy to these people as well. But they are critically important, because otherwise, if it is just isolated, or we feel isolated, then what are we to make of this? How do we make sense of this? Because there are times when we have a hand in it, but there may be other times when we simply came across somebody who was not deserving of our trust, and we participate in that, but now we're left questioning all these things, and it might make us question relationships outside of what happened with this particular individual. So do we have a good secure base, a good safe haven, a collection of people around us to make us feel secure still?
Exactly. And so then the final one is that, where does the trust come from? It could be actual betrayal in a relationship, either a current relationship or a previous one. Could be cheating, infidelity, could be like dishonesty. It doesn't have to necessarily be an actual physical act of, cheating. It can be like, emotional one. And I think that can feel like betrayal if our partner's not being honest with us, hiding things from us, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe it's not just cash register honesty, but the emotional component. Is the person honest with their thoughts and feelings? Can I be honest? Are we comfortable with each other in that sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we'll go into a few things you can do to build trust. And now this is building trust sort of from the beginning or more generally. And like we said, we'll talk a bit more in part 2 about like what to do when there's been a betrayal. But some of these things also apply as well. So the first place to start, which is, you said, is like start with yourself. So you need to feel as though you're coming from a secure place. And so there's a need to understand where your ability to trust comes from. So that requires some introspection and looking at what associations or preconceptions you have around trust and what experience you have with trust in relationships. And so some of this work can be done on your own, but it's also something that, depending how deep this is and how embedded it is in your psyche, is you may need some support in dealing in really digging into this. Yeah, especially stems from childhood.
Right.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that you make a very good point, that we need to feel as though we are coming from a secure place, because unfortunately, what happens, say with lying, for example, lying and cheating, it's no longer just about the sex that might have happened. It is then leaving us wondering, well, if we found out that there was a lie about this, what else has been a lie? So it's no longer about the affair. It becomes about trust. It becomes about, can I really believe you when you say this thing? And if we have a great network around us, then we can say, well, this incident happened with this person, but it doesn't rock the entirety of my being. But if we are really so invested in a person, then it might make us wonder about, well, what about other relationships and things? What do we have as a secure base to know that this was an incident, that this is specific to this person and not the world in its entirety, that the world in its entirety can be a safe place, and that we have the ability to recognize the difference between what it is that has happened with this incident or this person, and how we can still feel as though the rest of the world, myself, my area, is trustworthy.
Yeah, and if there hasn't been an incident, a specific incident, then that's the other piece to look at, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where is it coming from within, and releasing those things or addressing those possible traumas within you, so that you can be in a better position to feel trust for others.
That's a perfect point, right? So if it's not isolated to this one incident or this one particular person, and I see this playing out in many other areas, then very often that might be an indication of a deeper seated trauma, something that's happened previous. This is a history of this, and now it's playing out in these different areas in my life. Again, either way, they are things that can be addressed, and we can do much of that in being with somebody who is able to guide us along, like a therapist or coach.
Exactly. And so I think it's important, and this is probably a hard thing to do if you're one of those people that starts from a position of someone needing to earn your trust, is to be aware and talk to your partner about how you feel about trust. Just being honest and saying, I would like to work through this, but I want you to be aware. And if you are the partner and have someone who's has a hard time trusting, being a really good listener and acknowledging where they're coming from and sort of meeting them there. I think it's important to not take it personally if you have a partner that just has a more of a general lack of trust from previous experiences or life circumstances growing up, and recognize that it might take time for them to feel more trust in you.
Right. So we acknowledge where they're coming from, and we resist personalizing it. And then we also make the acknowledgement to ourselves, to them, that it might take some time to rebuild this. But we meet them.
I love how you summed that up in a much more simple way than I presented it.
You laid it all out clearly for us.
So the other thing you can do to build trust is to start small. So
Hmm.
like any habit, I think trust is a bit of a habit too, right? And so for the person who has trust issues from the start, it's best to start where, like at the beginning, when the investment is lower. So
Hmm.
I think you meant I don't know if you created this idea of this trust line of credit. And looking for examples in a new relationship with someone where you can trust them, and add these to your partner's trust line of credit.
So do you have a couple of examples what falls into that line of credit?
Yeah, and it could be like very basic things, right? That are they a person of their word? Do they show up on time for dates? Can you rely on them to follow through when they say they're going to do or say something? Are they forthcoming, showing their vulnerability with you? Are they being open and honest and vulnerable and showing you that you can trust in them?
That's interesting. Also, are we proving that we can trust ourselves? Can I trust myself to be a little bit more vulnerable, knowing that I will be okay?
Yeah.
So do I simply put it upon the other person to do all of the heavy lifting, to do all this demonstrating as far as trust? Or am I able to recognize my partner and be an active participating in demonstrating or inviting trust?
Yeah, and I think that's the way to do it. I think we both, both partners want to be able to demonstrate through words and actions that you're trustworthy, and it can be very simple things, like we said, showing up on time, following through on plans, not canceling at the last minute, and then for both people, finding the evidence and being mindful of our position of mistrust. So when things happen that are good, that shows that someone is trustworthy, then make a note of it in that trust line of credit. And even if it means you have to write it down to remember in times where you might feel distrust, like these examples, collecting the evidence, as I like to say. Similar to what we do when we're jealous, right?
Absolutely. It reminds me of something that we had met somebody at the Taboo show in Toronto who mentioned that they have a jar. Perhaps you remember what they called the jar, but they would basically put affirmations into the jar. And whenever they were feeling vulnerable or doubtful or insecure, they would simply go to this jar and it would remind them of all these positive, wonderful things.
Yeah, I forgot. They had a really clever name for it, and I totally said I was going to steal it, and I wrote it on a sticky note, and I think it's still in the bin with our show stuff. But it was a great, I love that.
We'll reach out to them. Maybe we'll have them on the show because they have a lot of.
Well, I think they were interested in talking about how they approach non-monogamy. We met some really cool people, but I love that because they said when their partner is out, and they're feeling that, they open up these little things or little pieces of paper, and they open them and are reminded about how amazing their partner is. And so it could work too for trust, a trust jar,
right?
Like a spare jar, but better.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting to consider how we could find evidence to look at how there might be kind of demonstration of mistrust, but then use that as a talking point, use that as a learning point, and find out how the person receives this invitation. Are they wanting to simply minimize it or deny it? That doesn't really feel like it creates great trust. Or are they able to recognize their partner? And then what can we do in our agreements that will be course corrective? How can we really speak to what was creating these feelings of mistrust, and how could we feel greater levels of trust?
Yeah. So that's a good segue into the fourth thing, is increase your levels of trust. So you start small and then you start to increase it. And you're really paying attention to the situations, the facts, and asking yourself, is our trust being recognized and honored and validated? Or is it being violated? And I think this is where the facts of the situation, rather than the feelings, because feelings aren't facts, come into play, and being really aware of what is happening in the moment. And then if it is being honored, being conscious of allowing ourselves to be more trusting. And maybe we give a little in terms of some additional vulnerability of ourselves, and allow ourselves to invest in the relationship more. And if you're coming from a position of distrust or someone needing to earn your trust, this may be a difficult thing to do. But as you see more examples, can you allow yourself to then continue to be more vulnerable, be more open with them. And then that will build that trust within yourself.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like a great format for us, right? We are going to continue demonstrating this and increasing our levels of trust as it seems appropriate, as it feels good. But we are aware of our tendency perhaps to not want to be participants in this, but we will invite ourselves to kind of increase these boundaries as we see fit, as they do feel that way. But again, we go on the facts. We want to be objective. So our past might inform us in feelings that say, well, it's not safe. But until the other person gives us good reason to not feel safe, we might invite ourselves to say, well, so far the demonstration has been positive, and I do get the feeling that they are trustworthy. They have been acting in accordance to our agreements, and this does create greater feelings of trust. So I will allow myself to increase my emotional investment in this and feel secure in doing so.
Yeah, and I think in part of that, to increase your levels of trust is really to communicate what your needs are. And then when those needs are met, then adding that to that trust line of credit and continuing to allow yourself that openness. There's still a possibility that we might be meeting people that are distrustful. Mm-hmm. And so, still being aware of the facts, and if we are paying attention to or ignoring any red flags and that sort of thing. And so really paying attention to that, and, that could happen, but also not making that always the ends, right? And going back to the facts. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just before we go, a quick sort of thing, some examples of how trust can be broken in non-monogamy, because that's where you started off and said, trust can be broken in any kind of relationship, friends, family, intimate relationships. But sometimes people think that if you're non-monogamous, that means you cannot break someone's trust or cheat or that sort of thing. So we thought it'd be good to give you a couple of examples that we can talk more about in part 2 when we're diving into how to rebuild trust.
Mm-hmm. So some examples of that could be, well, if we were, say, for example, unclear in our agreements and they result in actions that feel like cheating, simply by perhaps withholding information, right? So it's curious because some people say, well, if it's an open relationship, you can't cheat on there, you can't lie. And then we know in non-monogamy, well, that's just not an accurate statement, because we can definitely be withholding information or cheat or know that it's not going to land well. So as a result, we're not forthcoming with this. And that doesn't honor the agreements that we've made with each other, our value-based agreements.
Mm-hmm. So there's sometimes lying by omission, right? So you're not necessarily lying, but you're also not sharing information that maybe you agreed to share. And so that can be a way of losing someone's trust, especially if, they find out, which people tend to find out things eventually, right? We either show our hand or, other actions show it, but lying by omission. And I think you made were you going to say something?
Well, it's just interesting, right? So if I lie by omission, in a sense, what I'm saying is I don't trust that I could share this information with you and it's going to be well received. So again, it becomes a trust issue, right? I'm not trusting that I could really say these things for whatever reason. Well, if I'm already starting on that foot, then there is already issue with trust, as opposed to feeling more secure and saying, well, no matter how I think or feel, I could share this with you and I can trust that you will at least be able to listen to it. Maybe we don't agree with it. Maybe it doesn't culminate in the result that I want, but I trust that I can have these thoughts and feelings and they are shareable or not. Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned unclear agreements, and I think that can cause things. Sometimes people don't even have agreements in their relationships. So they may do, one or the other person may do something that the other feels is not what they agreed because they assumed things. And so that can get people into situations of mistrust because, well, they should have known to do this, or they should have known that this was a thing, or that this would impact me. And so that can sometimes cause some distrust in a relationship.
But how could they possibly know unless we've communicated it, right? Because it goes back to our old broken record. We always say that it's all about communication, communication, communication. and probably more so in non-monogamy, because we are in many ways emotionally more vulnerable in doing these ways of non-monogamy. So it really then speaks to the idea that we must communicate well, and we must be willing to make these open, honest, and trusting agreements.
Mm-hmm. So another example of how trust can be broken in non-monogamy, or I mean, it could be in any relationship really, is broken promises. Mm-hmm. And I think about, like, that could be in an established relationship, but I think one of the things that people find when they're dating or doing dating monogamously or non-monogamously is people don't stick to plans and cancel at the last minute. And so it can cause people to feel a bit distrustful of other people, that they will stick to their word, or or that they're going to be disappointed all the time.
Yeah, and for good reason, right? But it's interesting because it makes me think about the idea of consideration, right? Maybe they have to cancel for whatever good reason, excuse me, but how does it leave us feeling? And if we ever have to do it, how does it make them feel? So we then have consideration with each other. How would it make me feel? And what do these things do? And how can I go beyond these disappointments or these broken promises? Again, we find more of that in part 2. But it is considering how these broken promises will affect us.
Mm-hmm. And there's also manipulation and misrepresentation. So there are people out there that might misrepresent what their relationship style is in terms of non-monogamy, or whether or not a partner is on board or not. And, I hate to hear it, but I do hear it all the time, that people end up finding out that, another partner was not on board with there being a non-monogamous relationship. And it was more of a DADT, don't ask, don't tell, or just a don't tell. So that can happen as well.
Yeah, these are big flags that go up, right? When we've witnessed this or been part of this in these kind of misrepresentations or manipulations of the situation. And they can really take us back. They can make us feel very unsettled and very vulnerable and insecure.
Yeah. And sometimes people, when they're first opening up an existing relationship, establish rules, as a means of feeling secure. And, a partner might agree to these rules, but then not really wanting or believing in those things, and then breaking them. And then that can cause mistrust in the relationship, which is why we always suggest agreements rather than rules. And we talked about that in one of our podcasts in season 1.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So there's a huge difference between, in this case, a rule and an agreement. The rule could be an edict where we are simply put it upon the other person because it is so very important to us, but they're not really volunteering their alliance to it or their agreement, or do they really see why it is so important for us to have such a strong part in this? And is it being used to create a sense of security, compared to then how we can both really come to this similar position where we both see and agree to the value of this. And it makes it much different in how we participate in this, how we honor these things, as opposed to it simply being, well, I have to agree to this because, for whatever reason, they want that. And I don't really see the meaning, the significance, the value in it, but I simply are either doing it to agree with them or feeling in any way coerced into it. It's dramatically different than we are really coming into this because we are wanting this of our own as well.
Absolutely. And then the big one, of course, is like infidelity and cheating. And that can happen in non-monogamy. It happens all the time. And that could look like, if you're just more of a lifestyle sort of relationship, or swinging, where you're doing things together. Maybe you're meeting someone outside of that individually and you haven't agreed to that. So that would be considered infidelity or cheating. Anything that kind of goes outside your agreements with your partners would fall into that category. And it could definitely have an impact on your relationship in general, but also your ability to stay non-monogamous, because this happens often.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? People might have been monogamous and then opened up the relationship, and it wasn't done quite as smoothly, or there were, don't ask something, there were whatever reasons not working well. They did not support themselves to succeed in this open style of relating. And so they say, well, it's open relating that's no good. Let us go back into monogamy. when in fact it's not the style of relating, it is the lack of transparency that there might have been trust issues here. So it's not about how we relate in a mono or poly, it's about how are we able to be open, honest, and present in either of those scenarios.
Awesome. Well, that's a great place to end. So in terms of your next steps, if you're listening to this and trust is something that you struggle with, or you want to just increase the trust you have in your relationships, start with looking introspectively at your levels of trust and think about how you might increase your levels of trust with others and increase your own self-reliance, trusting yourself. If you do have issues that are longstanding and you do come from that position of mistrust, then definitely reach out and get support on that. There's we're out there. I'm a coach and Andre's a therapist. You certainly can reach out to us, but there's also probably local people in your area that you can reach out to and get the support that you need. And then if you are somebody who's new to polyamory and non-monogamy, or you're wanting to set a secure foundation for your relationship, take us up on our offer to take our Poly Newbies digital course, a 7-module course that helps you set a foundation for being in relationships that are secure, sexy, and satisfying. And you can always reach out anytime to us via Facebook Messenger or through commenting on this post or through our website, and we'd be happy to talk to you. So thanks, Andre.
Thanks, Tara. Thank you, everyone.
Next episode will be part 2, and that's on how to rebuild trust that's been lost. That'll be an interesting one. Thanks,
sure.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thank you. Bye.